It's the morning of August 12th, 2010. We are at the Eagleton Institute at Rutgers for the Rutgers program on the governor. I'm Michael Aron of NJN News. This morning we're going to talk to Chris Daggett. Chris was a deputy chief of staff for Governor Kane early in the Kane administration. He went on to become a federal administrator of the EPA Region 2 office in New York City during the Kane years, returned to the administration at the end of the Kane administration as commissioner of the Department of Environmental Protection. He was a candidate for governor in 2009, and he currently heads up the Geraldine R. Dodge Foundation. Chris, you're a New Jersey native, is that correct?
I am.
Give us your history in the state. Where were you born? Where'd you go to school?
Born in Orange Memorial Hospital, and lived for a brief period of time in Nutley, then moved. My father was with New Jersey Bell Telephone Company and was asked to manage the Pleasantville office, so we moved down to Linwood and spent 7 years down there in the mid to late 50s. Then he got transferred to Newark to be in public affairs in the Newark office of New Jersey Bell and 540 Broad Street, the old NJ Bell. And so he found a place in Basking Ridge in 1962, and my family moved there then, and I've been in Basking Ridge ever since in a number of different places, but basically in Basking Ridge except for school. I went to public high school and public school system through Ridge High School in Basking Ridge, and then on to the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill for an undergraduate degree, and then I got a doctorate in education from the University of Massachusetts. So that took us to 1977 when I came back to get involved in the primary election of a fellow named Ray Bateman, who was running against Tom Kane in the primary election of 1977, and they were both running against OTB. If you remember OTB in your political days, it's one-term burn. And Ray, of course, won the primary pretty handily, and then in 1970, then lost the general, widely expected to win, but didn't. And then in 1978, Ray set up a consulting firm called Public Affairs Consultants and asked me if I'd join him, and I did that for 3 years. And then in 1981, Tom Kane ran again and asked me if I'd join his campaign. He and I had gotten to know each other because in 1977, after the primary, when Ray beat him, to show you again the sign of the times versus what things are today, I was then working in the East Brunswick office on Route 18 of the Bateman campaign, and we looked up one day and there was Tom Kane standing there asking, "How can I help?" And so, true to form of the day, the losing candidates often rallied around quickly the winning candidate and would help out. So I ended up working with Tom to help Ray, working on debate preparation. Tom Kane and I did a lot of that work, and that was how I first got to know him, and we kept in touch. And then in '81, he asked me to come back and work in his campaign. So I was the guy that traveled with him in the primary. I got him up in the morning and put him to bed at night. And so came to know Tom Kane probably as well as I guess anybody does. And when you spend hundreds of hours of time with him in a very close setting, in cars and other forms of transportation, and being with him as much as I was. And then when he won, he asked me to stay on as deputy chief of staff, and I did that for the first part of the administration, and then shifted over to a position known as cabinet secretary, which made me the liaison between the cabinet and the governor's office. And in that capacity, because of my background in education and Tom Kane's background, I also did all his education and higher education policy. So I worked on a lot of the education issues in the early days of the Kane administration. Got involved in a number of emergency activities. So as I told people, fire, flood, and famine in New Jersey, and I was the point person working with either the state police or the head of the Department of Environmental Protection or the head of the Department of Health or whoever it was to deal with a crisis. And it was in that capacity that I got involved in a lot of environmental issues, because it was the early days of the Superfund program when the federal government was providing a lot of money to identify and then investigate and clean up hazardous waste sites. And the first big crisis of the Kane administration, or the first big activity, was finding dioxin-contaminated soils on the streets of Newark. That got me involved in environmental issues that we then pursued a lot of Superfund sites in New Jersey, got them on the Superfund list. And then a vacancy came up at EPA for regional administrator. The Region 2 office covers New York, New Jersey, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands. It's kind of an odd mix, but it became effectively a bit of a battle between Tom Kane as governor of New Jersey and Al D'Amato, who was then the senior senator in New York, as to who would get the appointment. And when the dust settled, Ronald Reagan appointed me as part of his second term. And so I went to New York as regional administrator for 4 years, and then came back into the Kane administration. At the end of that stint, the end of the Reagan administration, Tom Kane asked me to come back in the cabinet as the commissioner of the Department of Environmental Protection. And then went, following that, toward the end of the administration, Bill Simon, the former Treasury Secretary, called me and asked me if I would become a partner in that firm. So I went off and became a managing director at William E. Simon & Sons in Morristown. Spent 6 years looking at a wide variety of environmental investment opportunities. Did that for 6 years, and we made an investment in a brownfields firm. So I left to basically start my own firm in brownfields and be a regional arm of that brownfield entity we set up. We did that only for a short time, and I then ended up doing things on my own in brownfields and did that for, 13, 14 years when I ran for governor as an independent last year. And following that, the Dodge Foundation board contacted me and asked me if I'd be interested in running the Dodge Foundation and competing for that in a search they were doing. And when the dust settled on that one, I was selected. So I'm now running the Dodge Foundation. And along the way, I've also served in a lot of nonprofit boards, mostly in the area of the environment and education and land use. So bit about all over the lot, but had a very interesting time for a long period of time.
You were interested in politics from an early age?
Yeah, my parents were always actively involved. My father was in South Jersey. He was on the school board and eventually the president of the school board in Linwood. My mother was very active in the AAUW and in the Episcopal Church Women. I was raised as Episcopalian, and my mother was actively involved in those kinds of activities. When we moved to North Jersey, I had actually been president of the student body in high school. I had been vice president of the student body at the University of North Carolina. So I had been active in sort of public affairs issues wherever I was. And I actually ran for a township committee in the primary of 1984 and was the primary. There was no opposition, and I was after the primary election, was the candidate for township committee in Berners Township, but I got appointed to EPA, and the Hatch Act, which is a federal act barring involvement in partisan politics as a federal employee, I dropped out of that race in order to continue at EPA. And actually my father stepped in and filled my shoes, so he went around telling people he was following in the shoes of the footsteps of his son. But in any event, he served on township committee and then became mayor a couple of times. It's a rotating mayoralty. So sort of public affairs and public involvement has been in my family and in my blood since I was really a kid.
Why'd you go to work for Ray Bateman in '77?
Good question. Actually, I was finishing my doctorate at the University of Massachusetts. I was working actually in Montreal. I was asked while I was at UMass as a student, some people came down from McGill University and were intrigued by a program I was involved in. We were training university faculty how to teach. And we had developed a unique program that no one else was doing, and McGill folks asked me if I would come to Montreal and establish a program there. So I went up to Montreal and started the Instructional Development Service Project. McGill University did that for 2.5 years, living in Montreal while I was still finishing or working on my doctorate. and actually did my dissertation topic around a project at the Montreal Children's Hospital. And came back Christmas of 1976, went to a Christmas Eve party, and Bill Taggart of the old Taggart Driving School fame, who I'd known for a number of years, asked me if I was interested in getting involved in a political campaign that was starting to take shape in New Jersey. So I said, sure, why not? And because I was winding down my doctoral work and figured that would give me a reason to finish my dissertation. If you know the world of higher education, a lot of people get to a point called ABD, all but the dissertation, and they never finish their doctorate. And I was bound and determined to finish it, and that gave me a goal, effectively, to say that I would do this job starting in May. So I basically took the next 5 months, finished up my dissertation, and came back to New Jersey and got right involved in the campaign, in the Bateman campaign.
Did you know Bateman prior to that?
I did not. Never met him before. Didn't even know anything about New Jersey politics, really, in any great degree. And so I jumped in and was asked to do organize a telephone bank in Bergen County. You've been around long enough, you might remember this. The county chairman was a guy named Tony Statiel. Tony Statiel. And Tony was as county chair, and there were 3 other people that were involved at the time, and unbeknownst to me, did not get along that well. John and Ganamort, who was actually with Tony Statiel for a while, so actually he and Tony, I think, got along okay, and I think he was sort of the right-hand guy to Tony. And a fellow named Dick Vanderplatt, who was the owner of the local funeral home, or one of the local funeral homes, and then Gary Hagedorn, who was then, I think, maybe an assemblyman. I'm not sure if he was a state senator at the time or what role. But the 4 of them were up there as the sort of the power brokers, if you will, of the county. And I was asked to put a phone bank together. In those days, you would get a whole bunch of phone names that you would literally have to put together manually, and with some help of computers. But those were the days when all this was in its infancy of really doing it in any organized way. And we organized a phone bank that made 10,000 phone calls in Bergen County and was a factor in us winning that county. And then came back into the, after that I was asked to come back in and work at headquarters, and that's why I ended up there in East Brunswick when I first met Tom Kean.
It's funny how Gary Hagedorn was just a guy back then, and now, many years later, we're fighting over closing or keeping open a psychiatric center named the Garrett Hagedorn Center.
Right. Exactly right.
What was your first impression of Tom Kean?
Well, my first impression, it's interesting, in campaigns, if you're on opposing sides, you don't always have a good impression. So my first impression wasn't that good because I was working for the other guy. And Tom was a good candidate, but not a very good public speaker. Tom was, but he had a good background. He was strong in the environment. As you know, he sponsored the legislation. He created the Department of Environmental Protection in 1970. He had a good reputation among the environmental community, which actually was not my area of interest at the time because of my background in education. I was more interested in the education side. But he had a good background, but Ray clearly then had been the president of the state senate. He, I think, was certainly the favored candidate among the county chair people across the state and most of the leaders of the Republican Party, but it was a pretty spirited campaign. And my respect for Tom grew during the time, and particularly after he came into the campaign at the primary and I got to work with him. Then I got to have a very good and strong respect and appreciation for his skills, both politically and also substantively, because I think Tom has always had a very policy-oriented and substantive approach to the work he's done in government.
You say he has a good feel for the state of New Jersey politically, or for the game of politics? What?
Both. Tom is, he came up in a political family. He grew up in Washington and spent some time there. He was here in New Jersey. He has as good a political sense as anybody I've ever worked with, both from the general standpoint of politics with a small p, as well as with a big P, and knowing the state of New Jersey. He's, and I think that came clear in part of the time actually before I got involved with him, which was the when he became Speaker of the State Assembly. I mean, that was a masterful political stroke that ultimately led to his becoming the Speaker. So he, terrific politician.
Why did Bateman lose to one-term Byrne?
A combination of factors. I think they never really had campaign leadership that was clear, and too many people were I want to say running the campaign, if you will. In name, that wasn't true. I mean, there was a campaign manager, there was a campaign chairman, but it wasn't well run overall. And then I think Brendan was extremely effective at the whole issue, as you remember, was over the income tax, and the fact that Brendan Byrne had instituted the income tax in response to the Supreme Court closing, basically, or forcing the schools, the issue over equalized funding in schools caused the state to have to come up with an alternative way to finance schools, and the income tax was put in place as all part of that. That income tax was very unpopular, and Ray campaigned against it. But in the campaign, Brendan Byrne was very effective at saying, okay, Ray, fine, be against the income tax, but what's your alternative? And he kept hammering him and hammering him about it. And Ray, very much like Tom Kean, was a very substantive and very savvy politician. But he also believed in being straight with people in the sense of saying, I do need an alternative. And everybody counseled Ray to say, you don't need to come up with a plan. You can say nothing. You can just be not Brendan Byrne and not have an income tax and worry about it after you get elected. And Ray, it troubled Ray, and he said, no, I have to have a plan. And eventually he put together a plan, but it was, and I don't know if you were at that press conference, but I remember that press conference very well. It was on a Friday night at the Robert Treat Hotel in the presidential suite toward the end of the campaign. It was in late October, not quite late, maybe mid-October or so, I think it was. And the press had been clamoring for an answer because Brendan kept the heat on. Where's your plan, Ray? Where's your plan, Ray? And every time he turned around, where's your plan, Ray? And members of the press corps picked up on that. And so finally Ray put together a plan. And the plan was crafted by a group of people. But at the same time, Bill Simon was head of something called he and Millicent Fenwick had teamed up to head up the Bateman, or the Simon Fenwick task forces on different aspects of New Jersey life. And one was on business, one was on education, one so on, different task forces. And Bill, to everything I knew in the campaign, had virtually nothing to do with the tax plan. But at that press conference, they combined two things: releasing the business report of the Bateman, or the Simon Fenwick task force, and sliding in a tax plan. And Brendan, the moment it came out, to his credit, and this was brilliant on their part, called it the Bateman-Simon tax plan, although I don't really believe Bill had, and somebody else who was closer than I was to some of that would probably be able to tell you better, but I don't think Bill Simon was involved in that tax plan much, if any, at all. But immediately Brendan Byrne called it the Bateman-Simon tax plan, or as he said, the BS plan. And he then spent the last 3 weeks of the campaign running around New Jersey, admonishing Ray for putting forward the BS plan, and then did one final brilliant stroke, which was, it was the very first of the property tax rebates that Brendan put together. It was their idea in that administration. I'm not sure who came up with the idea, but that was where it first started, to give a rebate on the taxes, and that rebate check came to everybody's mailbox on the Friday before the election. And I can remember Ray Bateman going back to his house and telling the story that when he opened his mailbox and pulled out his check that gave him X hundreds of dollars of rebate, signed Brendan T. Byrne, governor, he knew he was in trouble, because effectively that was a very effective way to buy votes at the end of a campaign, if you will.
He told us that story in this chair and said that was the night he knew he would lose.
No kidding.
And
then my memory's right.
And 30 or 40 people in this chair for both the Tom Kane archive and the Brendan Byrne archive have talked about the BS plan, but nobody until you has parsed it where we knew about this Simon Fenwick task force and how the two were rolled out simultaneously.
They were rolled out simultaneously, and it was done. I'll tell you who was there. Nick Brady was there, former U.S. Senator Nick Brady, who was then head of Dillon Reed. The chairman of the campaign, Dick Sellers, the former chairman and CEO of J&J, was there. Bill Tremaine, I think, might have been there from Prudential. Bill Taggett was there. Al Fasola was there because he was the campaign director. He was he ran the campaign. Roger Bodman might have been there. Who else was there then? I'd have to think back. Of course, Ray Bateman was there, and it was a mix of people that have been involved.
Was Bill Simon there?
Oh, Bill Simon was there. Yes, of course. Bill was there because of the release of the task force report.
What did you do after? You told us earlier, but refresh my memory. What did you do in the 3 years leading up to the next gubernatorial race?
I did a couple things. Actually, I helped Bill Taggart out for a while at his driving school, opening up some operations in Chicago. So I flew out to Chicago and helped Bill set up a branch of his driving school out there. And I did that very briefly because in mid-'78, Ray Bateman set up public affairs consultants, and then asked me if I would join him in that effort. And so the work I was doing with Bill was not really I didn't really like spending much time in Chicago, and I was really a New Jersey guy, and I was real interested in public affairs by that time. The campaign really gave me bit hard on the public policy side and got me really interested again in that whole arena. So getting involved with a former gubernatorial candidate and a guy with the stature of Ray, I jumped at the opportunity. And so we did that. And then actually in 1979 or 80, we merged with Keyes Martin, which was then the biggest public relations and advertising firm in the state, and the advertising and the firm that was most allied with the Byrne administration, doing a lot of the work, including the travel and tourism account, which was headed at Keyes Martin by a woman who ultimately became my wife.
B.
B Horvath was the head the account executive for travel and tourism account in New Jersey. And so when Ray Bateman and I when Ray merged public affairs consultants with Keyes Martin, I met B, and we ended up getting married.
Dan Gaby was Byrne's friend who ran Keyes Martin.
He was, and Dan, as you know, just passed away last year. And Dan was a terrific guy. Got to know him quite well over time. And actually, he was also, at one point, I believe he was a primary election candidate for the U.S. Senate in 70-something, 74 or 72, yeah, somewhere in that time frame.
Yeah. You say that during the campaign for governor in 80 and 81, your role was to be the guy who put Tom Kane to bed at night, so to speak.
Got him up in the morning, put him in bed at night.
How did you get into that position?
I wasn't able to come to the campaign till May because I finished my doctoral work at UMass and defended my dissertation and went to graduation, did all that sort of thing, and came back in late May. So it was I wasn't involved in the primary election for all practical purposes. And in the general, in the primary election, Andy Consovoy, if you remember, Andy Consovoy was the guy that traveled with Tom Kane. And they wanted Andy to do things more in the headquarters, and they wanted somebody to travel with Tom. And They knew that Tom and I knew each other and got along pretty well, and they asked me if I would do that, so I said sure. And it gave me an opportunity to really get in the thick of the campaign in a way that I probably otherwise wouldn't have.
What was that like?
Great experience. I mean, from the personal, you get to see New Jersey, you get to be in the thick of a campaign, you get to be in the middle of all the issues associated with the campaign, both from a substantive standpoint and an operational standpoint. You get to help out the candidate and provide the sorts of things that a candidate needs, which I've now found out from running myself. I mean, it's
things like what?
Well, everything from the simplistic, like making sure that when it's noontime you find food somewhere, to the making sure briefings are right and that they get there in time, and that the headquarters people are constantly in contact with you because the candidate's out speaking or something. So you're in the back of the room, you're on a cell phone, you're on a pay phone at the time. Exactly, that's what I say. You're on a pay phone calling in and figuring out what it is you've got to do in terms of the next event or whatever it happens to be. But it's basically it's a management of a person, if you will, from all the logistics associated with that are both mundane and simple to the much more important and substantive of making sure that somebody is properly prepared for every event that he or she goes to.
And you did this in the general election after Tom Kean
had won the primary.
Correct. Had you worked in the campaign during the primary?
No, because I was really finishing up my degree, and I mean, I was in contact with the campaign, but I was not doing any work really for it per se.
Was Tom Kean a good candidate that year?
He was a very good candidate, and he got better as a public speaker. He came to be an outstanding public speaker by the time he got through that campaign. Terrific at giving extemporaneous speeches about a wide range of issues. Always well-liked, very personable, very good with the press. In fact, one of the things that we always kidded about was we were always late for events because Tom would exhaust reporters. Reporters would finally have questions, and he'd finally say, "Would you have any more questions?" And they'd have to start thinking of other questions because he would literally have the patience and would drive us crazy because to him that was an important component of getting the message out, was spending the time with the press that was important from both a policy standpoint but also from a political standpoint.
Do you agree with that in hindsight?
Yeah, I followed that same approach when I did things. I made sure that I always got back to members. In fact, I did it when I was in his administration. I would always find out when deadlines were and get back to reporters before deadlines. I would spend whatever amount of time was necessary because if you're in the business, you appreciate that a reporter's got a job like everybody else, and one of the jobs is to get the view of both sides on an issue. And whether it comes out for you or against you, you're better served, in my mind, of getting that information out and responding to questions than you are hiding from it or otherwise not being willing to address it.
Did you think Tom Kean was going to get elected?
We knew, and again, this isn't what I was as close to because I was in the field. But if you talk to people like Roger Bodman and Al Fasola and others who were in the thick of the campaign, we knew going into the final Friday that we were within 3 or 4 percentage points, but tracking polls weren't sophisticated enough at the time to know over the weekend. And we knew the momentum was coming our way, but you couldn't tell whether it was going to come far enough. And so come election night, it was, as you know, undecided. And we literally sat for the next, I think it was 30 days it took us, or 26 days, I forget the number of days it took, where I literally would go then to Tom Kean's house and we'd do some odds and ends of things, and we'd maybe have a meeting or two and do some transition things, but you really couldn't get into transition because you didn't know who won, who was going to be governor. So no one would give all of their time and energy to transition to either Jim Florio or to Tom Kean. And so it was this period of uncertainty, but we were pretty confident after the first couple of days that we had the votes. The question was, after all the recounts and all the possible shenanigans that could take place in fooling around with election results that people were worried about, that maybe it would swing the wrong way. As it turns out, I think it was handled very fairly and very well by all sides. And, we were fortunate to win by, 1,787 votes, I think, out of 2.2 million that were cast.
Why was momentum going Kane's way at the end of the campaign? Was there a turning point? Was there something that stands out?
That's a good question. I don't know if I can remember a turning point per se. Again, people probably in a headquarters might have felt that to some degree more, but being in the field, and I was certainly there. I mean, I could feel it in the enthusiasm of crowds. I could feel it in the enthusiasm or in the response he was getting to meetings that we held, whether it was small groups of meetings or one-on-one or in larger groups. You could feel that people were enthusiastic about it. But I don't know that I could point to any one event in the campaign that turned it around. Maybe if somebody refreshed my memory on an event or two, it would make me remember it. But I can't think of it in the field.
Some people have spoken about debates, and other people, actually, Tom Kane himself has said Jim Florio took a vacation that summer and he chose not to, and he thought that he made some headway at that point in time.
Yeah, that's possible. Although I don't remember that Florio took one and Tom didn't. Jim was not as at ease in a crowd as Tom was. That was always a factor for Tom. Jim was more ill at ease in small and larger groups than Tom. Tom just is a very personable person, despite what a lot of people thought, that he was more of a patrician and that he had a wealthy upbringing, and that Jim Florio was more the person of the people, if you will. And in some respects, how it came across in the campaign, as much as I have come to respect and appreciate Jim Florio and have worked a good deal with him on a number of issues in New Jersey subsequently, and have enormous respect for him, I think in that campaign, the way it came out, Tom Kane was more the person of the people than Jim Florio as time went on and as people got to know Tom Kane.
Was there some line about having a beer in a bar in Bayonne?
Absolutely. It was, that came partly out of the work of Ray Donovan, I think, and the work Ray did. Ray had been the head of Reagan Democrats, if you remember, and then Ray got involved in Tom Kane's campaign, and the whole idea of Reagan coming in and having in debate. I think Reagan came into Bayonne, if I'm not mistaken, and a big campaign event. And I think the feeling was Tom Kane could go and have a beer in Bayonne as well, and surprise people at his ability to do that, and he was good at it.
So the recount happened. Your side won. Was it clear to you that you'd have a job in the administration? Do you recall how that came about? I
recall how it came about, but it wasn't clear in that I had hoped to do it. But Tom Kane was a person who, to my knowledge, and others might tell you differently, but I don't ever remember him giving a promise to anybody about a job in any capacity at all during the campaign. And he came out and took the attitude of trying to find the best people to get involved. I was honored and thankful that he asked me to join the administration. As you know, in the transition, he got a search firm together and used a search firm to find a number of cabinet members. So it was clear that it wasn't just paying off people who he got to know over time, and paying off in the positive sense of the word, not in a negative sense of the word, but Tom tried to find good people in the administration, and fortunately he had already selected Lou Thurston to be the chief of staff, and they had a meeting one day and came out of the meeting and asked me if I'd be the deputy chief of staff. So all during the transition.
One of one deputy, or were there several deputies? Then
it was one of one. I was the only deputy chief of staff, and there was a chief of staff, deputy chief of staff, cabinet secretary, And there were, and of course you had chief counsel and head of policy and planning, but it was a much smaller operation in the governor's office those days than it is today.
What did you do as deputy chief of staff?
Several things. I had responsibility for sort of basic organization in the office took care of all the scheduling, took care of the communications side, which primarily the mail side, in that the communications head was Bob Grady, doing the sort of the press side with Carl Golden, and the communications generally on substantive issues. But you had the whole mail operation, which in those days was not computerized. It was all, mail came in and it was looked at by hand and then responded to by hand and typed out as an answer. It was a pretty slow process, and we started to bring some discipline to that and get our arms around that. And then, as I mentioned earlier, I did all his education and higher education policy because of my background. So while Gary Stein was the head of policy and planning, the only area he didn't cover in the policy side was education and higher ed, which I handled.
What did you do in education and higher education? What did you accomplish?
Well, the first thing,
with Tom King?
The biggest thing was probably on the education, not the higher ed. On the higher education side, Ted Hollander was the Chancellor of Higher Education, as you remember. And one of the asterisks of the Kane administration, and many people don't remember, was he had a fiasco over the appointment of the education commissioner. The first education commissioner was a fellow named Ron Lewis. Ron Lewis was selected from I guess he was in Pennsylvania, and I can remember interviewing him. We had a small group. It was Lou Thurston, Gary Stein, and myself. I'm not sure if we had anybody else or not, looking for the education commissioner, and we settled on Ron Lewis. And unfortunately, it turned out that Ron had plagiarized his dissertation. And Bob Braun, who was then with the Star-Ledger as the education writer in the days when newspapers had subject-specific reporters, Bob Braun was the education writer, and Bob, through his enormously good contacts throughout the years that he had been the education writer, was tipped off that the dissertation might be a problem, and he went out and dug out the dissertation and found out it had been plagiarized and wrote a big story about it. And I can remember taking a helicopter flight with, I think it was with Lou Thurston, actually, either Lou or Gary, out to Pennsylvania to tell Ron Lewis that he wasn't going to be commissioner after we had said he was going to be commissioner. And so we then, on the rebound, had to find somebody else, and in the search process, found Saul Cooperman. And Saul turned out to be just an outstanding education commissioner. And Saul came in, and I came to work very closely with Saul on issues. And if you remember, in this Labor Day weekend of 1982, I think it was, the first year, we did something that had never been done before, which was had a joint session of the legislature, a special session of the legislature, for a speech on education by a governor. And Saul Cooperman had come up with 6 items that he thought were worthy of passage in the legislature. You had the takeover of schools legislation, you had the alternate route to teacher certification, you had a minimum salary for teachers, you had the teaching academy, which was a training program for teachers, an in-service type of a program, and 2 others that I'm forgetting now. But we had governor's school, right, was one of them, and then there was a 6th one. But we put it together in a speech, and that was one of the signature moments of the administration, in that Saul and I were working on trying to put a speech together, and we were working with a speechwriter who is a woman named Catherine Brokaw. And Catherine was charged with writing the speech, and Saul and I couldn't seem to get Catherine to put it together the way we wanted to, and each draft came up and it was short on what we wanted. And I had come to know Tom very well in his education feelings and his speaking style from all the speeches that I had been with him on during the campaign. And we came up to Labor Day weekend, and we had said to the legislature we were put a hold on the idea that on the Tuesday after the Labor Day that there was going to be a speech, but we didn't notify the legislature because Carrie Edwards, who was the chief counsel, didn't want to notify them unless we were sure that we were going to do it, and we couldn't get the speech together. And literally on Thursday before Labor Day weekend, I came in and I said, look, Carrie wanted to just call the whole thing off, and Gary Stein wanted to call it off because we didn't have a speech. And so I said, look, give us, what's the latest we can have? And he said noon Friday, because if he didn't tell the legislature by noon Friday moving into Labor Day weekend, it wasn't going to happen. So Saul and I took Catherine Brokaw aside and said, Catherine, and we went to then the Commissioner of Education had a home provided by the state. It was in Montgomery, just off of Route 206. And we met Catherine Brokaw at about 8 o'clock that night and sat her down and said, look, Catherine, here's what you got to do. And we need you to do it. And so we left her at 10, and she was supposed to show up at, I think it was 8 o'clock the next morning in my office at the State House. And 8 o'clock came and went, and Saul Koopman was out of the U.S. Navy, and Saul was a person who, if he said the meeting would start 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock or 11 o'clock, a meeting started at that time. And so at about 10 after 8, Saul called me, where's Catherine? I said, I don't know, she hasn't showed up yet. And so a little bit more time went by, about 8:25 or 8:30, Saul called me again and said, Catherine's here. He said, I'm reading her speech. So I went down to Saul's office, and I read through it, and I said, I know Tom Kean, and I know this issue, and I know what you're trying to do. If this speech isn't it, I don't know what is. This is on the money. And so at about 10 minutes to 12, I came into the governor's office with literally warm documents from the copy machine and put it on Tom Kean's desk, and Gary Stein and Lou Thurston, and I said, this is it as far as I'm concerned. I think this is it. And so about 20 minutes later, we all agreed that was what we could work with. And so we told the legislature we'd have a special session on education. And in the following, we had the special session. Tom gave the speech. It was very well received. And then over the course of the next couple of years, Saul, to his credit, managed to get all of those proposals enacted in the legislature, the ones that needed legislation, and put into place others that didn't. And that became the signature event in education because it allowed us to take over the Jersey City school system later on. And when the takeover law, it allowed us to have an $18,500 starting salary for all teachers as a minimum, which at the time, you look back, it's you think $18,500, but that was a lot of money then for teachers, and it set a national precedent. We had the alternate route to teacher certification, which became a national model. Literally, we did some things in education, largely driven not by me. I mean, I was the policy guy, but and I certainly was in the thick of the give and take on it, but it was really to the credit of Saul Cooperman and the work he did to both come up with and develop the proposals in the education office, and then to come on a regular basis. He and I would sit down with Tom Kean and go through the policies and get his feedback on it. But Saul drove those things through to fruition, and Tom Kean became known as the education governor as a result of that. And then I represented Tom at the Education Commission of the States, which was the national organization of the various state entities and governors on education. And I managed to engineer Tom Kean to become the head of the Education Commission of the States following Jim Hunt, who was then the governor of North Carolina. Jim was a very well-respected education governor, and I managed to engineer the appointment of Tom Kean ahead of Bob Orr, who was then the governor of Indiana. It usually went, each year it would change from a Democrat to a Republican to a Democrat to a Republican to head the Education Commission of the States. And Bob Orr was in line, and I managed to get that switched out, and Tom Kean as the head of the Education Commission of the States. So between that and all the work he was doing in education, Tom became known nationally for his work in the field. And so we did a lot of good things on the education side that, looking back, I'm still pretty happy about.
How many years were you Deputy Chief of Staff?
Just about a year and a half or so, and then I shifted over to the position as Cabinet Secretary. Because as you remember, after the first, I forget the exact timing, but Lou Thurston had been the first Chief of Staff, and that didn't work out as well as everybody had hoped. And Lou shifted out, and we brought back in Greg Stevens. Then Ed McGlynn, who had been the right-hand person to Erwin Kimmelman, who was then the Attorney General, came in to become Deputy Chief of Staff, and I took the position as Cabinet Secretary. And that made me the liaison between Tom and all the cabinet departments at that point, and for a number of issues that would come up, and that's how I got ultimately involved in the the environmental side. But so I was probably about a year and a half as as Deputy Chief of Staff, and another year and a half or so as Cabinet Secretary, and then in August of 1984, I became Regional Administrator. So that would be, let's see, we started on January of '82. So actually it was only 2.5 years or so that I was in the governor's office before I left and went to the federal government.
You made reference to dioxin before. As a journalist, I remember the uproar when dioxin was discovered in the Passaic River in Newark. Was that a significant moment during your time as Cabinet Secretary or as Deputy Chief of Staff?
It's probably the biggest, in the sense that and it was not actually in the Passaic River, it was dioxin-contaminated soil on the streets of Newark.
Diamond Shamrock.
Diamond Shamrock on Lister Avenue in Newark. And dioxin, it became an international news story just like that. And
Why?
the reason was because of the dioxin contamination in Japan that had done huge damage to a whole town. I mean, I forget begins with an M. I forget the name of the town in Japan, but it became an international news story because of the news over that, the knowledge of that, what was going on in Japan, and people knew it was a very problematic contaminant, in that if you were exposed to it, you could get bad rash, and you could also, it was associated with some respiratory issues, and so people were very scared of it. And it was effectively airborne, in that if it was in the dust or in dirt, it could be in a storm or whatever, it could blow up as dust. Or it could be on people's windowsills, or they could be exposed to it in a number of ways. And people were concerned about it because of, in the extreme exposures, what happened over in Japan. This was not nearly the levels that you saw there, but it was in the dust. And so people were understandably concerned and scared over their own health. And what happened is that that's when I first really started to work closely with Bob Huey, because he was the DEP commissioner, and with Rick Goldstein, who was then the commissioner of health. We got on top of it, but I had to work with Ken Gibson, who was then the mayor of Newark, and his police director, whose name I'm drawing a blank on, who ultimately went down to Washington as head of the police some police institute in Washington. I forget his name. But the police director and Ken Gibson and I sat in a room one day.
Junius Williams?
No, it wasn't Junius Williams. I
Whatever.
forget his name, but in any case, we went to a meeting in the Ironbound section of Newark and closed the swimming pool, this was in the heat of the summer, and the farmer's market, which were two very popular places in Newark at the time. And we were not popular people as a result of that. And we tried to deal with that. The emotion around that just was starting to get really out of control. And I can remember going into the Ironbound in the middle, late at night on a weekend, trying to get people calmed down. It wasn't in the form of it wasn't in a congregation of a lot of people. It's just that people were upset generally, and there was a lot of angst about what was going on. And so I was working closely with Bob Huey and with Rick Goldstein, trying to get on top of it from a public health standpoint and from an environmental standpoint. But out of precaution, we felt we had to close the swimming pool and the farmers market for fear of people's exposure to the soils and the dioxin contamination in the community.
I seem to recall Governor Kane coming up himself.
Oh, yeah.
Walking.
Oh, absolutely. We had Tom Kane walk in the streets of Newark, and we had press conferences. I mean, it was if you go back in the press in those days and the stories, it was a very big story at the time. And it was the first, as I said, of Superfund, in that Superfund was passed in the late days of the Carter administration, December of '79, in the last year, and then it hadn't really gotten cranked up in terms of its implementation until the Reagan administration, because you remember, you moved into 1980, you had the presidential campaign, and that's not a whole lot was going on. As often happens, the government slows down in its activities during a presidential campaign. And so come the January of 1981, which was the beginning of the gubernatorial campaign for New Jersey, the Superfund law was starting to get implemented. Well, in '82, as it was really just starting to get some legs to it, was when we discovered dioxin in the streets of Newark. And so we then took advantage of the fact that there was all this federal money, and we went on a tear, we being largely led by Bob Huey, to identify hazardous waste sites in New Jersey and take advantage of all the federal money that was available. And at one point, and Bob will be able to tell you the statistics better than me, but I think we, one year, got something like 33% of the money given out nationally to investigate sites. And one year, I think we got 60 or 65% of the money available nationally for what's called remedial design, which is you've now figured out what the problem is, you figure out how you're going to clean it up, and now you have to design the actual physical cleanup, if you will. And that design money that was available, we got something like 65% of it available nationally. We got in New Jersey because we were so aggressive about identifying and then addressing our hazardous waste problems. And as an old industrial state, we had a lot of them, and as you know, still do. We still have a legacy of Superfund sites. So that became a big issue in New Jersey, is the whole environmental side. And I got in the thick of that because as Deputy Chief of Staff, and I was responsible for the emergency activities, working with the state police. And by the way, it was not just, we had the state police involved, so Clint Pagano, who was the colonel at the time and the head of the state police, was involved with us. So we had Clint involved on a number of occasions when we had some really serious issues from an emergency and a public safety standpoint. And then we had health issues associated with potential exposures, and then environmental issues associated with cleanup. So the four of us, Clint Pagano, Bob Huey, Rick Goldstein, and I we're working pretty closely on a lot of those environmental issues. And then we'd bring in Tom Kane as necessary to either do press conferences or to meet with people or to do whatever had to be done to address the problems.
What was the difference between the Greg Stevens-run governor's office and the Lou Thurston-run governor's office?
Greg was much more, and unfortunately, as you know, Greg passed away a couple of years ago, but Greg was much more of a no-nonsense, highly political, very savvy, from a press standpoint, because he started, I think his first job was with the Easton Express, possibly. I think it was Greg Stevens' first job.
At one point, he worked for the Woodbridge News Tribune.
I'm sorry, Woodbridge News Tribune. It was Carl Golden who was at the Easton Express. Woodbridge News Tribune was Greg Stevens, so he knew the newspaper world and the press world. He was also very much believed in hardball politics and doing what was necessary to make things happen and get them done politically, knew how to use the power of a governorship to get things done in the legislature together with Carrie Edwards. I mean, Greg was a very aggressive and formidable chief of staff, and that was what was needed. Lou was much more collegial. He came out of the legislature, if you will. He had been head of the Senate staff and had more of a legislator's mentality than an executive mentality. And by that I mean you know, a legislator's mentality is more about trying to build coalitions of people to get a number of votes to pass a bill, whereas in the executive branch, you got to make decisions and go and get things done. And that was Greg's style. Lou's was more the legislative style, and it didn't really fit the chief of staff role in the way it did with Greg. And so Greg came in and was just hard charging about we got to get things done, and we got to get it done by using the power of this office and being willing to play hardball when it's necessary to get our agenda through.
Was it the dioxin story or experience that gave you your environmental portfolio that lent credence to the idea of you stepping into an environmental role
Yes.
in the federal government?
Absolutely. Now, having said that, if you look at what knowledge you could argue someone should have to run the EPA, I didn't have it. I mean, it was a classic political appointment, if truth be known. I didn't have a background in the law. I didn't have a background on the technical side. When I got to EPA, I couldn't name all the environmental laws of the country, and I was the top federal official. So it's the way democracy works. I mean, to the victor go the spoils, and people get appointed to positions, as you know, in whether Republican or Democrat, that may or may not have the credentials necessary to handle it.
Unqualified?
I was, from the standpoint of technical and legal understanding about environmental issues, but the one, and this is what I learned in that job that has served me for some time, and that is that running organizations in government is not necessarily about knowing all the issues. It's about knowing how to work with people and to get things done. And I learned pretty quickly that if I could work with my staff well, and I could think on my feet, and I could handle myself at press conferences and press briefings and at legislative hearings, and know enough to be able to know what I knew and what I didn't know, and be able to acknowledge what I didn't know, but then to quickly follow up and get that information back to whomever it was that needed it, and then know how to manage people. That's what you need to know to get things done, and I was fairly good at that, and so that served me well as I got into EPA. And then the sort of the technical and legal and substantive side, I either learned enough to be able to handle it myself over time, or in those jobs you snap your fingers and you got a room full of technical experts or legal experts on it. So I had the backup in the staff to cover what I didn't know, but I learned a lot very quickly, and in the end I think, and I'm the worst judge, I mean you got to ask other people, but I think I was able to handle myself pretty well and ended up with a pretty good reputation both at EPA and then ultimately at DEP.
Why do you think Tom Kean prevailed over, was it Al D'Amato, you said, in getting his person into that spot?
That's an interesting question. I don't know that I know. You'd probably have to ask Tom that one. Maybe he had the better relationship. It was part of Al D'Amato's attitude was, I'm the senior senator in the state in which the position is housed, because the office was in New York. Tom Kean's position was, but I'm the governor of one of the states in the region, and so I should have a say also. And so it was a combination of that, but also we interviewed, and I would like to hope that as in the interview process that I went down to the White House and interviewed with some staff people at the White House, and I would like to think that I interviewed better than D'Amato's candidate, but again, those are things that you'd have to ask others. I really don't know, but in the end, I was selected.
When you get an appointment like that, do you get a moment with the President of the United States, or?
No, actually, I didn't. I didn't have a moment with him, but I had a moment with the people at EPA, and then ultimately worked closely with the people at EPA. But no, not always do you have a moment with the President himself.
So you went to Region 2 headquarters in New York in August of '84, you say?
Right.
And how long were you there?
4 years, till I left in September of '88 and came back here into the cabinet, but had kept in touch. In fact, one of the interesting things was, do you remember, this was a campaign issue in 1985. I was barred from politics. I mean, I'm a federal official, but I would sort of keep my hands in what was going on. And every day I drove from my home in Basking Ridge into Lower Manhattan. And I always had to go past the PJP landfill. If you remember, the PJP landfill was the landfill that was burning for about 30 years. And it had this haze of smoke that on good days was a little bit, on bad days was a lot.
What
that
municipality was it in?
It was in Jersey City. It's right under the Pulaski Skyway. So the smoke would come up and drift across the Skyway, and every day I drove through it in the morning and I drove through it in the evening, as did tens of thousands of people. And I can remember calling up Tom Kean in about somewhere in 1985 at the beginning of the campaign. I don't know whether it was early, I can't remember. I have to look back to find dates, but I said, if you want to do something for your campaign, put out the fire at PJP, because it had defied solution. People had tried to put it out with water, but it was an underground fire, and those aren't easy to put out, and they can smolder for years, and there's garbage there, and as long as you have a little bit of oxygen, you can, basically it'll smolder. I said, put it out. And Bob Huey can tell you the story because he knows the details better than I do, but basically he hired the firm Boots and Coots. You remember that firm?
No.
Boots and Coots is a Texas wildcat firm that used to put out oil well fires. And they're the ones that perfected the way to put out oil fires at rigs, almost like you saw the on-land equivalent of the spill that we just dealt with in the Gulf is a fire out of control on a well on land. And they would go in and they developed the technique that dynamited fires, because you'd go in and these guys were crazy. I mean, you talk about risk takers, and that's why they were wildcatters basically, but they would go in and they would figure out how to detonate a fire out of control that momentarily would suck the oxygen out of the air and extinguish the fire just like that. So Bob Huey got the Boots and Coots guys to come up and look at the landfill and said, yeah, we can deal with this. They came up here and they effectively took apart the landfill bit by bit and put the fire out and recompacted the landfill and put it out. It's never burned since. And that became an issue in the campaign, in that we put out the PJP landfill fire. I say we, the DEP, but it was, I had called up those guys and said, you know, I'm driving through this every day, twice a day, as do a lot of people, and it was this acrid smell. It was just, you know, it was burning garbage.
From your vantage point in New York, in the federal government, but with all sorts of friends and contacts in the Kean administration, why did Tom Kean so easily win re-election in 1985?
Two reasons. Peter Shapiro was a young, green guy with, I mean, what was he, 32 maybe at the time? Something like that. He had become county executive at age 26, I think, or something. He was pretty green, didn't know a whole lot of what was going on. Very bright guy, terrific guy, but just young. Tom Kean by that time had gotten a head of steam going. He had had a bunch of successes. He had terrific environmental record at that point, a terrific education record. As you know, Tom, one of the signature attributes of Tom Kean was his ability to get to work with the minority communities, and had outstanding relationships with the black community, with the black ministers, with a number of the leaders in the black community. And he ended up with, I think, what, 60-something% of the black vote in the 85, and basically had a head of steam. And Peter Shapiro didn't have the long-standing experience and background in the Democratic Party to get his own party together enough. So, and Tom had done a masterful job of working with Democrats, such that a lot of Democrats by that time supported Tom. So when you add all those things together, it wasn't a fair fight. I mean, Tom just, you know, handily won that election, at least from, again, from my vantage point, looking at it from New York and watching. And you know, I'm somewhat of a political junkie, and I'm constantly reading the papers, even to this day, about politics and the policy side of life in New Jersey. And But from my perspective in New York, that's sort of how it played out.
In your 4 years at the EPA, what were the highlights?
One of the biggest highlights was making the decision to put the final nail in the coffin, if you will, of the West Side Highway, the old Westway project, which is sort of an EPA lure, one of the big issues in Region 2, because it prompted a tirade from Al D'Amato that spilled over into, and actually you should ask Tom Keene, it's an interesting story in that I had, as I came into EPA, one of the first things that I was hit with was something called the Draft Supplemental Environmental Impact Statement for the West Side Highway project. And it had been 14 years in the running, this project. Ronald Reagan had come in with a mock check for $85 million. Every politician in New York except for Bill Green, who was the congressman in the district, and a guy named Ted Weiss, who was a congressman on the west side also, and the environmental groups. Other than them, everybody in New York seemed to be for it. The construction trade unions, all of the major business people from David Rockefeller down through all the major leaders, all the politicians, the press, all endorsing this project. And this decision comes down as to whether or not EPA ought to let a permit be issued so that the Army Corps of Engineers could fill 250 acres of the Hudson River and create this filled area below which you'd run the West Side Highway and above which you'd build all kinds of new commercial and residential and office space.
Fill 250 acres, that sounds like you're filling half the river.
It feels like it, but it isn't a lot. But it's a lot in terms of potential destruction of habitat. But 250 acres is a lot of land, but along a strip a couple miles long, it's not as much as you would think it would be, but it's a lot.
You say run the West Side Highway under?
It was going to tunnel under that. It was the proposal, was to tunnel it under this fill once the fill was put in place.
And
then build on top of it. So you'd have this expansion of the island, basically. Okay. And it had been a long project with all this support, and this document lands on my desk. And as I told you, I didn't have the background in it. But I thought, the only way I know how to deal with stuff like this is to just dig in and read it. So I literally read this supplemental environmental impact statement. And at the end of it, I felt I didn't need an advanced degree of any kind to see that the conclusions they drew were not warranted by the facts they presented. I mean, it just... And then I got the technical people on my staff had already long ago decided that from a technical standpoint, it didn't fly, and largely because the fill would have a very strong impact and destroy a bunch of the breeding grounds for the striped bass, which was the issue. So long and short of it is, and I can remember this as clear as day because Al D'Amato ahead of time had asked to meet with me when I was first considering my recommendation. The way the permit process works, the permit is issued by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, but EPA can comment on it, as can two other federal agencies, Fish and Wildlife, the Department of Fish and Wildlife, and the Marine Fisheries. But one of the agencies, EPA, had a big stick in that you could veto the permit if you didn't like it. So the big question of the region was, what was I going to do on the recommendation? And as I said, I read it and thought that it didn't make sense. As technical people made a big case for why technically it wouldn't work, but in that interim period while we were reviewing it, Al D'Amato asked to meet with me about another topic. And in the middle of that conversation, he turned to me and he said, are you going to, with an expletive, on Westway, are you going to basically screw us on Westway? So I was a little stunned because I hadn't met with a U.S. Senator before, and here he was using some pretty interesting language and clearly for this project. And I said, Senator, I'm going to do what I know how to do, which is I'm going to look at the facts and let the facts drive what I decide to do. And on the decision, as it turns out, was due January 21st, 1985. And the reason I remember it so clearly is January 20th, 1985 was the inauguration of Ronald Reagan as president for a second term. January 20th fell on a Sunday. Ronald Reagan said that he wasn't going to celebrate because it was a Sunday, but he would be sworn in, and that celebration would be the next day. And so that just happened to be the day that my decision was due on what my recommendation was on the permit. So we wrote this letter recommending denial of the permit, and out of courtesy, I faxed it to Senator D'Amato before I announced it publicly. And about 10 minutes later, my phone rang, and Al D'Amato spent my secretary came in almost ashen-faced because I guess he had said something to her first, but so he was on the phone. I picked up the phone, and he proceeded to give me a tongue lashing that was so filled with foul language and telling me that he was going to call David Rockefeller and tell him that I screwed him and that I screwed New York and all the construction trade unions and the newspaper. He was going to call all these people. And who was I to do this to New York and so on and so forth? And I said, Senator, I'm sorry, I disagree with you, and I hung up. And he then took the letter and found Tom Kean at a party in celebrating the inauguration and jammed this letter in Tom Kean's face and said, basically the same sort of things he said to me. And Tom, to Tom's story, and you'd have to ask him, basically said, well, I know Chris Daggett, and I think he probably did what he thought was the right thing, which wasn't what a politician like Al D'Amato wanted to hear. And so it further inflamed him. But the long and short of it is, I found out later, Al D'Amato indeed called David Rockefeller, and he called the construction trade union. He told them all the things that he told me he was going to tell them. But in the end, the Corps of Engineers issued the permit anyway. And so now I had a decision to make, because remember, I had veto authority potentially. I could either, by the law, I could elevate it to Washington and ask Washington to handle it because it was just too hot for the region, too big a political issue. Or I could do nothing, or I could veto it. So I first tried to elevate it to Washington, and by then, the new administrator, I came in under Bill Ruckelshaus. Bill Ruckelshaus had left, and Lee Thomas was now the administrator, and I elevated it to Lee, and Lee looked at me and he said, I'm not taking this. You started this problem, you got to handle it, so I'm not going to allow you to elevate it. So at any rate, I went back to my staff, and we talked about it, and we decided that of the two choices left, to veto or do nothing, that either one of them you'd end up in court. If I vetoed it, the proponents would come in and take us to court. And if I did nothing, the opponents, the environmentalists, would come in and take us to court. And the way the process worked, nothing new was going to happen. In other words, I'd go through the whole veto process. I would have to start from scratch, do all kinds of scientific study, and do an analysis. And I asked the staff if anything would change in the conclusion. The answer was no. So I said, then why are we going through the veto process? We're going to end up in court anyway. Let's take a chance that we've done all the work we need to do. Let's do nothing. So we decided to do nothing, and sure enough, the environmentalists sued, and on the basis of the letter we had written and some other work the attorneys did, the judge threw out the permit, and Westway was dead. And so that happened within the first 3 months of my time at EPA, and unbeknownst to me, I mean, if I could have planned it, I couldn't have planned it any better. It gave me a lot of credence in the environmental community because I stood up to, in their eyes, I stood up to a president who had come and given a mock check. I had stood up to all the political forces of New York, all the economic forces in New York, and said this is wrong from an environmental standpoint. And so I got a lot of credibility in the environmental community that served me well over the next number of years when I had to make tough decisions on other things that went against the environmental community and went for the business community.
How many tongue lashings like the one D'Amato delivered have you received in your career? None.
That was by far the most. And actually, I should tell you, 2 or 3 years later, Al D'Amato called me up like a long-lost friend because he needed something out on Long Island. Oh. And so, and from then on, I had a terrific relationship with him. And he was that kind of a guy. I mean, he could get really upset about something, but then he'd come around. later on if he needed something. But I've never had anything quite like that before or since, and I chalked it up to, it's part of the world you live in when you're involved in very emotional issues in the political world.
You spent 4 years in that job, and then you were called back to the Kaine administration. Why?
As I left the governor's office and went to EPA, and then the administration changed in 1985, Bob Huey had been the DEP commissioner, decided to step down. It was right around the time I was appointed to EPA. When I was appointed to EPA, my deputy was a fellow named Dick Dooling. Dick Dooling had been
your deputy where?
EPA.
At EPA.
So the deputy regional administrator, which is a staff position, Dick Dooling had long been the deputy. In fact, served as deputy so long that he had been acting regional administrator during transition times longer than almost anybody who served as regional administrator. When you added up all the days and months and years that for example, between the person who left my predecessor and my appointment, there was about a 6-month period or something like that. So Dick was the acting regional administrator. So Dick was frustrated that he had always been the bridesmaid, never the bride, and was never going to be selected as regional administrator, probably as a long-term employee at EPA. So he took the chance and went over when Paul Arbesman, who had been Bob Huey's deputy, left back in 1983 or so. I think Paul Arbesman left, and 84. And as I came in at EPA, Dick Dooling, frustrated, said, "I'm never going to get this position. I'm going to leave and go become the deputy at DEP under Bob Huey." He tried, and Bob selected him as deputy on the bet that if Bob ever left, he'd become commissioner. And sure enough, shortly after Tom was reelected, Bob Huey left, and Tom asked Dick to become the commissioner. So Dick took a bet that was successful for him, and he ended up as commissioner of the DEP. And just as I was ending the Reagan administration, Dick got an offer to go to what's known as Aron Water Technologies and become a senior executive there, and jumped at the opportunity to finally have to be in the private sector. And so the vacancy came up, and just as I was thinking about leaving EPA, and the timing was just right, and Tom asked me to come back. Actually, I think it was Dick Dooling's idea, suggested to Tom Kaine that he call me, and Tom jumped at it, and I jumped at it, and basically it was a good transition time because the Reagan administration was ending and the Bush administration was starting, and at that time I'd spent 4 years and I was ready to do something else. And so I agreed to come back as commissioner of the DEP.
How long did you serve? 4 minutes? How long did you serve as DEP commissioner?
I served there for basically a year, about 16 months, I guess. 16 months or so.
What was the highlight issue of that period?
The highlight issue of that was one of the big decisions was over the Great Swamp. There was a major issue with a sewage treatment plant expansion for Chatham Township. I used the vast sort of authority as commissioner to use what's called non-point source pollution, and the fact that the Great Swamp is like a bathtub. It can fill up and overflow. It doesn't have a drain at the bottom of it. And so as you would discharge more and more water into it, it would fill up and then cause problems in the surrounding towns. And I vetoed the permit application of Chatham Township, and it was a big issue for the environmental community, big issue for Chatham Township. And I formed, as a result of that, recognizing that I didn't solve the problem, I just stopped something. I formed the Great Swamp Watershed Advisory Committee, which ultimately became what's known as the 10 Towns Committee, and was one of the models, frankly, in New Jersey of good regional planning. We started as a result of that denial, and that was a big issue for us in that. And then another key issue was getting started on the cleanup of chromium contamination in Jersey City and in Hudson County. I signed what's known as an administrative subpoena to then Allied Signal, which is now Honeywell, PPG, Pittsburgh Plate Glass out in Pittsburgh, and Occidental Petroleum, which all had chrome production facilities in Hudson County, and I signed administrative subpoenas that demanded from them information about chrome contamination, which then, to his credit, Jim Florio and his administration ultimately negotiated consent orders and led to the cleanup, which is just now coming to final phases of chromium cleanup in Jersey City. So that was another issue that we confronted. Let me think. Oh, and the biggest issue by far was the garbage washing up on the shores of the beaches of New Jersey.
So tell us about garbage washing up on the beaches.
Started in the summer of '88 was the first big year. I was actually still at EPA. And then I transitioned over to DEP, and so I basically tossed the problem into my own lap, if you will. We were frustrated because there was a lot of garbage washing up, including some medical waste in the form mostly of hypodermic needles or small needles. Nobody could figure it out. Everybody thought it was illegal dumping. And I had worked a lot with the state police, and I knew that the enforcement community, if they ever really wanted to find something out or catch somebody, they could. It was a matter of focus of resources, and we had local, county, regional, state, and federal officials on the enforcement side trying to figure out who was dumping illegally to lead to garbage washing up on the shore, and they couldn't find an answer. So I figured, it's got to be something else. I mean, it just can't be illegal dumping. And we had the advantage when I was at EPA of years. We were the most aggressive state in the country about protecting our beaches in terms of water quality. EPA with Region 2 was the only region with a helicopter. We had a helicopter that started doing water samples from Cape May to Montauk Point, and we'd fly every summer, every so many miles, drop the helicopter down to the water, take a sample, and come out. And if we had too high a level of fecal coliform, we closed beaches. We were the only state in the nation doing that kind of stuff at the time, where we were literally working with the DEP and closing beaches that weren't safe for swimming. And so we always knew that if New Jersey beaches were open, they were clean. Well, this stuff was washing up, and couldn't figure it out. And I had worked enough with, as I said, with the law enforcement community to know that it had to be something different. It couldn't be illegal dumping. And from those helicopter flights, we also got to learn about the harbor and what was in the harbor. And it turns out there were a sequence of events that were occurring all at once that were adding to it. One, there wasn't a lot of litter control. People were dropping litter on the streets in New York and in New Jersey and elsewhere in the harbor communities. And in big rain events, the water washes into the sewers, and the sewers, the street sewers, if you will, the sanitary sewers, I mean the sewer systems in the what do you call it, stormwater lines, sorry, the stormwater sewers. The water would wash in the rain and take all the litter with it, and those stormwater lines would just dump right out into the river systems. And then so the garbage would go out there and then eventually end up on the shorelines. Well, if you looked on the shorelines of the New York Harbor, there were enormous amounts of debris. Mostly wood, because there's a lot of wooden piers, and even to this day, the wooden piers break up and the driftwood starts to float and it ends up on the shoreline. Then you had boaters in New Jersey and the harbor were slobs. They'd go out with lunches and beer and all this, and they'd throw everything overboard. Then you had beachgoers. Those are the days before, now in New Jersey, when you end a weekend, there are machines that go and claw through the sand to pick up garbage and stuff. You didn't have that being done. So people leave the beach on a Sunday, and it was the slobs that would use the Jersey shore. It was embarrassing, the stuff left on beaches. So between what was in the harbor, what was dumped overboard, then in the bays, where people were fishing, there was a lot of junk that was thrown. Fishing equipment, and again, debris from people eating, and boats just discarding stuff. And that water would come out of the bays and wash around and into the ocean. Well, you had all those events that were compounded, what we called high water events. A storm, big storm, high tide, and a full moon. And all that water would rise grab the material that was on the shoreline, pull it off into what we ultimately called refloatables, and it would get under the Verrazano Narrows Bridge by the trick of wind and tides. And if you remember, one year we had a 50-mile string of garbage, and it was because it was stripping off from under the bridge. And it would just go out, and then between all the stuff that was already in the shoreline plus that, then the tides would come in and bring it to the shore and dump it again on the beaches. And that was what was going on. And some of the people that were, why you had needles, is literally diabetics, among others, were using needles to inject insulin, and then they'd throw them in the sand. I mean, we had, and the debris in the harbor was just so much that it was all washing up on the shore. So what we did was we jerry-rigged a couple of boats, and this is now I was at DEP, and we figured out, and largely led by a guy named Don D'Aso, who was then the head of our air and water with George McCann, and who else was involved? Michael Catania was involved. He was my deputy at DEP. We figured out to get a bunch of boats working with the Corps of Engineers under the Verrazano River, under the Verrazano Narrows Bridge during high tide and high water events, and we'd start to scoop up all this stuff. We got couches, TVs. I mean, you could furnish your home under this bridge. But we started picking it up there. Then I worked with Bill Fawver, who was then the corrections commissioner, and we got prisoners to walk the shoreline. And the first summer, we picked up 4 million pounds of debris off the harbors of New York, and 96% of it, I think, was wood from all those piers. And we also had still different events going out in the ocean. We used to burn, the Corps of Engineers used to collect that wood, put it on barges, tow the barges out, and then burn it at sea, and then scrape the ashes off into the water. That's how they got rid of a lot of that driftwood. Well, on the way out, they'd overload the barges and the driftwood would fall off. That was part of our problem. So we basically stopped that operation, got under the bridge, walked the shoreline, and literally in 2 summers, we went from having a huge problem to having no problem. And that was also the period of time, remember the Mobro barge, the wandering barge that got loose and was wandering they were trying to find a home for it. It was a garbage barge, and it left New York, and they took it down to some place for disposal, and they wouldn't take it, and that garbage barge became a symbol of the garbage problem because every port they took it to wouldn't take it, and then they eventually brought it back to New York. Well, that was the same 2 summers that all that was going on. So this was a heightened awareness about garbage, and it was all washing up, and we managed to figure out how to fix it. And then we started sweeping the streets of New York, so the litter was less. We started cleaning the beaches of New Jersey. We walked the shorelines. We put catch basins at the end of storm water sewers so that when it did come out in high water events, we captured it. And so when you added all those events together, boom, the waters became clean and the beaches became clean. And ever since, we've been vigilant in New Jersey and done a really good job of keeping them clean.
We're almost at it. We're winding down. Let's just take a couple of minutes with 2 last questions. One, what was Tom Kane like to work with?
Tom Kane was one of the best people that I've ever worked with. I would tell you that, and I've told a number of people this over the years, I probably know him as well as I know anybody or as anybody knows Tom Kane, because I spent 75 days with him, 16 hours a day, and then in the years subsequent to that, I worked for him as Deputy Chief of Staff and as Cabinet Secretary. In the entire time I worked with him, at that close quarters, I never once, not once, heard him raise his voice. He could get frustrated at times, and you could see it if you knew him, but never once raised his voice. Always a decent person with people, always let people do and told people, the only thing that I want you to do is what's right. He wanted to get a heads up so you knew he knew what you were doing, but you had freewheeling position as a cabinet member or otherwise to do what you thought was right. You need to come in and talk with him and talk it through maybe, but in the end it was your decision and he wanted you to do what he thought, or what you thought you should do. And so between being just a decent human being and a decent guy to work with, knowledgeable about issues so you could talk with him substantively and about issues of the day, and the willingness to let you manage the way you thought was the right way to do it. Absolutely one of the best people I've ever worked with in my life. So I had nothing but high praise for his style, his approach, and I was thrilled to be a part of the administration and to have worked with him.
How should his governorship be remembered in New Jersey?
Well, probably as one of the, certainly in my lifetime, one of the better ones. I think he and Brendan Byrne stand out in particular. I think Jim Florio actually was a much better governor than he was given credit for at the time, and I think hindsight will be very fair to Jim Florio as governor. But Tom Kean was unique in that he started out with a very hostile legislature, in that it was a Democratic-controlled legislature, and he was a Republican. He figured out how to work with them. He figured out how to build coalitions. He wasn't afraid to make tough decisions. He had a strong legacy on environment and arts and education issues that I focus on now at the Dodge Foundation, because those are our areas of interest. But I work directly in education and the environment in my own work in government. And he has, in those three areas in particular, a very strong legacy. Transportation Trust Fund in the transportation side. There are a number of things that you look back that were started during the Kean administration that are either still going today or looked back upon as models to follow as to either how to govern or substantive issues about how to address things that I think really only were rivaled maybe by Brendan Byrne and his administration, because Brendan had some very big wins himself, and very ultimately he figured out how to work with people. But his was different in that he had a Democratic-controlled legislature also, so he wasn't in quite the situation that Tom was faced with. So I think Tom's administration will be looked upon very positively historically, and it's still looked back upon as probably the best governor, or one of the best governors certainly in my lifetime.
Thanks a lot, Chris.
Thank you.